Hey everyone, Reaper here again with another video. This time I want to talk about what are some of my favorite stories in comic books. Now I do another series, my favorite comic books. So what I'm going to talk about now, which most likely will develop into a series, and that series might intertwine a bit. But so does my affordable and my underrated series. When it comes to this video, there are differences in some of my favorite stories versus my favorite comic books. This one right here is just basically my favorite stories in comics. I mean, there's plenty of them out there that I like, and I've just selected several here that I'm going to talk about briefly. But with my favorite comic books, I may actually like the story, or I may actually like the artwork, or it might be a combination of both. So whenever I do a video of my favorite comic books, it could be any one of those things, any one of those combinations. Where this one, I'm singling out some books that may be in that other series, but that really stand out for me because of the story, not necessarily because of the art. So now that that disclaimer is out of the way, let's begin. Here we have 4 books. I'm going to briefly show you that I enjoyed the story very much too, and that is the Crow series. We have Crow number 1 right here, 2, 3, and 4. So this was the first of the Crow series, and I thought it was really good. You know, I've mentioned before that I like stories that are kind of more adult toned. Okay, I know that comic books are written for kids. Yes, I know, we got all that, and that's fine too. I liked several of those as well. But when I got into comics, I was a teenager, and reading these years later, of course, these were books that I really enjoyed. The story behind it, the dark tones, the more adult theme of The Crow. Now, I remember when the Crow movie came out, I think a lot of people do, when Brandon Lee was shot by accident with a real round, and that was a lot of a lot of controversy came out about that. So that was my introduction to The Crow. Okay. So when I finally added the books to my collection and I read them, I was like, oh wow, they really followed the movie fairly, somewhat. I know Top Dollar was the main villain in the movie, and I think he was killed in issue 1, so it changed up a little bit. When it comes to the artwork, like I said, this would be in one of my favorite books, largely because of the story, but not necessarily because of the art. I mean, the artwork here, I think it's okay. I think James O'Barr is fine. But, you know, it's just okay. Here's another one. Strange Tales 110, the first appearance of Doctor Strange. That is the story that I like the most in this. The others were like, so-so. But again, here we have the first appearance of Doctor Strange. And it's not one of my, again, it's a favorite book of mine, but it's also one of my favorite stories because it has that dark tone to it. Doctor Strange is trying to help some guy with his nightmares, and the story starts off with a man, it's raining and he's having trouble sleeping, and he seeks out Doctor Strange to help him, and Doctor Strange goes into his dream and finds the character Nightmare. I mean, that is just a fascinating, almost like Freddy Krueger type story. And naturally one that I'm attracted to. And that's why Strange Tales 110, although the other stories are, they're nothing spectacular by any means. What's his name? Paste Pot Pete and the Wizard against the Human Torch. I'll pass on that one. Not to diss anybody that actually liked that story or likes those characters, but for me it doesn't work as much as the story and the characters that were in the Doctor Strange. I think it was the last story in that book. Now, everyone knows that I'm a big fan of EC, so you're bound to come across an EC book in a video like this. So I'm going to choose Tales from the Crypt 23. I like all the stories in this book, but the one that stands out the most for me, the one that I remember when I was a kid reading in reprint form and really enjoying, was the cover story, which is Last Respects. I'll show you the book again. Okay, Last Respects. And you see the guy, he's trapped in the mausoleum, and the corpse is rising out from the coffin. That was not in the story at all. He got locked in the mausoleum, but he was locked there. He couldn't get out. No one could hear him scream. So he wound up opening up the coffins and eating the bodies, and wound up being poisoned because of the embalming chemicals and all that. No, one of the bad, the zombie, no one came back to life to kill him. So the cover's a little misleading from the actual story. But the story is actually very good. I enjoyed it very much, and I still enjoy it to this day. Brief guy elopes with this underage girl. They're in love, but the uncle, who's supposed to be the corpse coming out of the coffin, disapproves because, obviously he's an older guy. Not much older, but a little older. And he's from a poor family, and they have the marriage annulled, and then the girl gets sick, and I think it's the uncle. If I said grandfather, excuse me. Then the uncle won't let the guy see the girl, and she winds up dying, and out of revenge, he kills the uncle. And that's really the gist of the story. But he's visiting her and all that stuff. The police peg him for the murder of the uncle, and he's running away, and he wants to go see her one last time, and in the mausoleum. And when he does, he gets stuck in there. And it's not until days later when the police, I guess the gravekeeper or whatever, opens up the mausoleum. We find his corpse in there, and you find out the grisly details on how he died. So it's a really interesting, really good story. But that book, number 23, has a lot of good stories. Reflection of death and so forth. Here's another one. My favorite cover of all time, Haunt of Fear, number 12. My favorite story in this, there were a couple good ones. This is another book that had a couple good ones. But my favorite one in this book is the cover story, like with Tales from the Crypt 23. Cover story, Poetic Justice. These two guys plotted against this man who was, they wanted him out of their neighborhood because they felt that his house, he was, a poor guy, felt that his house would bring down the value of their home. So they, in their crazy way of thinking, devised a way to get him to move. But it turned out that it was so stressful, for the amount of stress they put on the guy, wound up hanging himself. And then he came back from the dead and got his revenge. Great story. Here's one of my favorite early X-Men books. Talk about impending doom. Impending doom is another Tales from the Crypt story from Tales from the Crypt 20. But I would apply that to this one. This was great. The whole issue, their X-Men are under the threat of the Juggernaut. They don't see him, but he's going through every fortification that they have set up, plowing through it because he wants to get to his brother, Professor X. And throughout the whole story, as the X-Men wait, as the Juggernaut gets closer and closer to where they're enclosed, Professor Xavier is telling all his students the story of the Juggernaut, how he's his brother, his stepbrother, and he's seeing flashbacks of Charles Xavier when he had a full head of blonde hair, when they were kids, and how his brother Cain, Cain and Abel, Cain became the Juggernaut. And then at the end you see him. Really, really great story by Stan Lee and Jack Kirby. I enjoyed it very much. A couple more with X-Men. My two very first X-Men comic books, Days of Future Past, 141, 142. Let me look at it this way. Oh, too much glare. My first two comics, when it comes to Marvel Comics, X-Men comics, were these two. I got these from watching the X-Men cartoon series back in 1993. Found out that they were in comic book form, and I decided to get them and became a comic book collector. We all know the story of Days of Future Past. It was made into a movie. Some of you may have liked it. Some of you may not have liked it. They've taken some liberties, but who cares? I found the finished product to be enjoyable, considering what they did with some other X-Men movies, right? So definitely One of my favorite storylines in comic book history. Days of Future Past. Got a few more here. Batman 232. Again, I became familiar with this story from watching Batman the Animated Series. The introduction of Ra's al Ghul, and it was pretty, it was fairly on target with what Denny O'Neil wrote here. It was really good, very well done. I like Ra's al Ghul. I thought he was a really nice new villain introduced in the Bronze Age, because Batman was really riding the coattails when it comes to villains of the Golden Age villains. And that's a good thing to do, don't get me wrong. But to me, he never really had any new Silver Age or Bronze Age villains. And there, of course, there was Poison Ivy, and they reintroduced the Riddler, they reintroduced the Scarecrow, but they were from the Golden Age. I think the only real prominent Silver Age villain or villainess that was introduced to the Batman universe was Poison Ivy back in, 66, 67? I don't remember the exact year, but around there. But other than that, he just relied on the Joker and all that, which was fine. But in the 60s, the Joker was turned, he was kind of tuned down a bit from the psychopath that he was in the Golden Age. That was all going to change around this time, when Neil Adams and Denny O'Neil were working on the series. And they introduced Man-Bat, they introduced Ra's al Ghul, they reintroduced the Joker, and they did a couple other great storylines together, not just on Batman, but in other series like the Green Lantern. And I think that that's one of the most prominent. And I really enjoyed the story of Ra's al Ghul. Really enjoyed it. He's a villain, one of those villains, and I always love these type of villains that they're not just one-dimensional. They're just not bad for the sake of being bad. They're just not evil because they want to conquer the world, and that's it. There is an agenda there that sometimes you may see yourself sympathizing with when it comes to Ra's al Ghul. A couple more. I've always loved horror stories. That much is known. I think you know that if you watch my channel. And this was one of my favorites in a superhero book. Some people may say Morbius has become a little overrated. Well, that's fine. But I loved the first appearance of Morbius, the story behind Morbius, and the continuation with Morbius. How Spider-Man was up against Morbius and the Lizard at the same time. Two monsters. Okay? Certain things the comic code authority would not allow, from the mid-50s all the way to the early 70s, like use of words like zombie or vampire and all that stuff. So they got around it by calling him the living vampire. I know, right? But anyway, it was around this time when comic books started to break away a little bit from the comics code. The comics code was still there, and it would be, I think, until the early 2000s. But it saw a period where it started to become laxed. And they started adding some monsters that were not used throughout the 60s. And Marvel did this with the Mummy, I think it was, and the Vault of Evil, and the Crypt of Shadows, and all that stuff. They started doing that in the early to mid-70s. And they introduced Dracula and Tomb of Dracula. And before that, they had Morbius here. And I loved it. I liked how he became Morbius. I liked how Spider-Man was almost a monster. He had those extra limbs. They really went all out from issue 100 to 102 with that storyline, and I thought it was really, really well done. Well done. Two more, and they're both Spider-Man books from the same era, the Bronze Age. I think a lot of people would agree with me. This was one of the best storylines from Spider-Man in the Bronze Age. I mean, I think a lot of people like the issue before this, the death of Gwen Stacy. Well, this is where Spider-Man maybe gets some revenge against the Green Goblin. The Green Goblin was the one that caused the death. Well, sort of. Green Goblin smacks Gwen Stacy off the bridge, and Spider-Man saves her by shooting a web at her to grab her. But when the web grabs her securely, she's going down so fast, the jerk of him grabbing her with the web breaks her neck. So it was the Green Goblin that was the catalyst of that that encounter, that situation. But some may say that it was Spider-Man that accidentally killed her. So no matter what you feel about it, it's still a very intriguing storyline that concluded here. I enjoyed this one so much because I was glad to see the Green Goblin get his at the end. And of course they brought the Green Goblin back in many different forms, including the original form, Norman Osborn, many years later. Last one for this video, one of my favorites. Amazing Spider-Man 129, First Appearance of the Punisher. I like the Punisher. I enjoyed reading this and I had this book for many, many years, as you know, and I only recently got it slabbed. Throughout the years, I've opened this and read it many times because I enjoyed it that much. How the Punisher was kind of duped into thinking that Spider-Man was somebody that needed to be punished. And, of course, he would have run-ins with Spider-Man again after this issue, but I really enjoyed reading this and how the Punisher, really was a big threat to Spider-Man in this issue. And the Punisher didn't really have any superpowers. He doesn't have superpowers. And it was interesting to see how he could take on Spider-Man. So those are just some books in my collection that I really enjoy this story. I'll come out with a couple more because there's quite a few. I know sometimes I'm a little hard on superhero stories, but make no mistake, there's plenty of them, including the ones that I've showed here, that I enjoy very much. So tell me, what are some storylines or one-shot stories in comics that really stand out for you, even though maybe the artwork doesn't always stand out, but the story stands out. The use of characters, the characters involved, really stands out for you. I'd be interested in reading. Take care, everyone.